Good afternoon. I'm Stefan Yost, the Michael and Sonia Kerner Director and CEO of the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I'd like to welcome everybody here to AGO.ca and this Zoom call. Particularly want to welcome the members of the Women's Art Initiative and the Curator Circle. We like to begin these events by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, of the Mississauga, the Huron-Wendat, Neutral, and Seneca nations. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We have two special speakers today. Renée van der Avoird, who is, she's our Assistant Curator of Canadian Art. So with Wanda Nanabush and with Georgiana Urelic, our fantastic team who's been really leading some extraordinary work that people globally are looking at their three work and what they're doing here at the AGO. We also have the Chief Curator of the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, Michelle Jacques, who worked for many years at the AGO. And so I want to welcome you back to Toronto virtually. They will be speaking about the work of Denyse Thomasos in the AGO collection. She's an artist who I had never heard of before moving to Canada, and I really feel like I should have heard of her because she's a fantastic, bold, extraordinary painter. So a couple of housekeeping things here. This will last about 35 minutes. If you have a question, you can add it to the Q&A box. And there's a couple people behind the screens who will take those questions and feed them to Renée. And then Renée and Michelle Jacques will talk for again, 25-30 minutes, taking your questions and weaving them in. I understand there's also a PowerPoint presentation, which is great to see how we can really see art. So welcome all to the AGO.
Thanks, Stefan. I've got the PowerPoint going here.
Okay.
There you go. And over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be joining my old community at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I'm coming to you from Victoria, the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And while I miss Toronto very, very much, I really do have to acknowledge how much I have learned since moving here, in large part because of the generosity of the local Indigenous communities. It is my absolute pleasure to be joining you to talk about Denyse Thomasos, who was a great friend and perhaps one of my favorite artists. I just have to do this for a moment. I don't know if you can see my tiny little Denyse Thomasos and the background, which was my going away present from the Art Gallery of Ontario when I left in 2012, because my love of Denyse's work was well known. I'm going first because I'm going to weave a little bit of biography into my reading of these two works, Hybrid Nations, and I'm also going to speak about Metropolis. And it's so interesting to me that Denyse and I share so much biographical background. We were about the same age and we came from similar backgrounds. She moved to Toronto, or to Mississauga, from Trinidad, where she was born when she was quite small, about 5 years old. I was born in Toronto, but born of Caribbean parents who moved to Toronto just the year before I was born. Denyse grew up on the west side in Mississauga. I grew up in Scarborough. And maybe it was because of this sort of shared history of a Caribbean heritage, of being from an immigrant family, of growing up in the suburbs, that when we finally did meet in 2007, when Ben Portis invited Denyse to be a part of the Wallwork series, we were very, very fast friends. In a moment that made me a little bit verklempt, when I was speaking to Renée about Denyse not long ago, I realized that in our 5 years of friendship, I attended her wedding and her funeral. So let's look at Hybrid Nations, the work up on the screen. As mentioned, this was created for the series Wallworks, which was a series that Ben Portis and David Mose and myself did during Transformation AGO. It was a moment when all of the spaces in the building had to serve multiple purposes. So what had been a dedicated gallery space was also used for events and programs of all kinds. So we decided to do this series where artists would work directly on the walls. The work would be relatively safe from all of the activity going on around it. And Denyse's contribution, Hybrid Nations, was created at a point where she was really coming into her own in this wall painting medium. She had started out as a studio painter working primarily on canvas. But in the year 2000, she was at an artist residency called the MacDowell Artist Colony. And she had challenged herself when she went to this residency by showing up with a pad of paper and some pens and pencils. And she didn't know what she was going to do. And she was given a studio in a cabin that had been inhabited by an artist whose name was Chin Feng. Just before she arrived. And he had left behind some inks and some brushes. He's a internationally renowned ink painter. And what Denyse did was take those remnants of Chin Feng's residency, and she created in that studio, in that cabin, work that covered the walls and all of the surfaces of her studio, just using these salvaged materials. And in that work, you started to see the same sort of elements that we see here. She had painted floor plans and gestural strokes. In that case, she also used a lot of writing to ask questions about her own history, to ask questions about who Chin Feng was. And in this work, Hybrid Nations, she's really sort of coming into her own with this process of mural painting. So what we're looking at in the center, the very precisely painted component, that is a sort of extruded floor plan of a super max or super maximum security prison. Denyse had become really interested in researching these prisons, actually managed to get invitations to go to them, to take pictures, to understand how architecturally they were used to confine people. And often people from the African American or Black community. So she was very interested in the long history of confinement of Black bodies dating back to slavery, and the way slaves were transported in inhumane conditions in slave ships. And all of these ideas sort of merge in Denyse's most mature work. So the way she executed this piece, she created that precise drawing, that floor plan of the prison ahead of time, sent an image, and then through projection and the talents of some AGO staff who I think are still there, Ben Oakley and Matt Janice, that image was transferred to the wall in advance of Denyse's visit to the gallery. And when she arrived, she created the image, the composition around that floor plan. And that image that she created, that she painted by hand, shows so much of the sort of facility and confidence that Denyse had as an abstract painter. She had studied painting since her early days as a student at U of T Mississauga, and continued that study at Yale University. And by this time was a respected professor of painting at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And in this image, you really see the way she thinks through the legacy of abstraction and how she can infuse her interests, her very political interests, her interests that come out of social justice, with an abstract language. And, you know, on the one hand, this really sort of plays on that sort of push and pull that we think about when we look back at abstract expressionism, while, of course, being an image that is completely infused with content, which the abstract expressionists always claimed to push against and try to avoid. And I think this was Denyse's great contribution. Maybe we can move on to the next work, Renée. Looking at Metropolis, this work is a few years later than Hybrid Nations. It was acquired at Art Toronto, I believe in, yes, there's the date, 2008. One of the great purchases of that program. And in this work, there is less of that sort of disjuncture between Denyse's look at a sort of real floor plan, precisely drawn, and her sort of interpretation, her gestural interpretation of the kinds of architectural forms that really informed so much of her thinking. Throughout her career, she traveled worldwide looking at architecture ranging from things like the supermax prisons to things like vernacular architecture made in Indigenous communities around the world. She was sort of very interested in this tension between the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The ingenuity of the way Indigenous communities in Africa and Asia would create space and architecture, and the architecture that was created out of legacies of imperialism and colonialism. So in this image, you don't see the same kind of obvious disjuncture between the two kinds of architectures that she's thinking about. Everything is much more fused. But if we look at, I think Renée has a detail, you can see that there is an overlay of a sort of more precise architectural drawing still in this image, which on first glance appears to be so much about a gestural abstracted language. And to me, you know, especially thinking about the name of this painting, what we're looking at is a kind of interpretation of urban life where technology has come to almost overtake or invade a more kind of natural, comfortable way of living in urban spaces. So Denyse is somebody that I was very close to, so you might think that I am just being biased when I say that I think she was a truly great artist, one of the great painters produced out of Toronto in the 90s. But I think that in her ability to think about abstraction in this way, where she, on the one hand, conveys complete facility with the language of abstraction, while infusing it with very personal and very political content, and creating something that is beautiful to look at, but also just prompts such important discourse. I think that is what makes a great artist. And I will pass things over to Renée now.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's an honor to hear you speak about Denyse from through your personal experiences. So thank you for that. I am going to speak about two other works in the AGO's collection. We have Dismantle number 2 from 1998. So this is going back in time to when Denyse was in about her mid-30s, so pretty early on in her career. And this work was generously donated by Richard and Donna Ivy just last year. So we're very excited about this new acquisition. So despite how small it might be on your screen, the work is actually 5 by 6 feet. And in my opinion, Denyse's work really shines when it's in this massive scale. During this early period, she was working to really perfect this hatching technique, and she was quite successful in exhibiting and selling works like this in Toronto and New York. This work was shown at Olga Korper Gallery in, I believe, in 1998. And Olga was quite keen on Denyse from the very beginning when Denyse showed at Mercer Union. The ice cream truck is driving by. I'm sorry if you can hear that. Anyway, Olga saw Denyse's work at Mercer Union in the mid-90s, and I think right away invited her to be part of the roster at that gallery. So a lot of Denyse's work has been shown at Olga's. So you can see she's painting adjoining grids. Some of the lines are straight and others are more erratic, and there's definitely a rhythm to the piece, but it's not quite predictable. To me, the work is so satisfying because of the all-over quality and the consistency in the ways that the forms are distributed across the canvas. I'm going to show you a detail. There, you can see in the detail there are these really beautiful intermittent diagonal lines that cut through and destabilize the overall structure. And what I love is that mix of calculated lines and spontaneous markings, which reminds me of the work of Joan Mitchell in a way. And I know that Denyse was looking at the work of Joan Mitchell. The painting resembles a patchwork or even a quilt, and it makes me think of the labor that goes into these endeavors, which are qualified as women's work. Denyse had an interest in African textiles, and that also comes into play here. Although I think the idea of labor is really key to this work and to this kind of body of work. When I look at the lines, I see labor, duration, temporality. The lines could represent the passing of time, you know, the scratching on a wall, like in a prison cell. And certainly the grids have a cage-like resemblance. And the piece in its entirety has this claustrophobic feeling of confinement. You know, there's no room to breathe. So we can see that, again, she's interested not only in prison architecture, but the psychological effects of such systems. And in her writings, she links the prison system to current day slavery. I have a quote from her, which I thought was very powerful. She says, "I am painting about the structural psychology of a mind that has been disrupted and disoriented through the Black experience of the Western world." 12 years later, she paints Made in Flight, which we received as a beautiful gift from Gabrielle Israelovich in memory of her beloved husband, Jacques. So another new acquisition, which we're thrilled about. We can see she's maintaining that interest in architecture, but is working much more openly and with a palette that is quite a bit punchier. Like in Dismantle number 2, this work is really beautiful in its intensity and complexity. However, here the forms are really floating in space, and you know, they could be expanding or contracting. There's a real dynamism to the work. I'm going to show you a detail of the bottom right-hand corner. Here you can really see the loosening of forms and the coloration, which is excellent. She's, you know, such a confident painter, and you can see it here in the brushwork. This work has more narrative elements than the earlier work. She's working in new ways with the vessel or the boat, which is archetypal in her work as it relates again to the transatlantic slave trade and the commodification of human lives. For Thomasos, the boat is a container that symbolizes the concept of slavery, so she revisits it quite often. This work is from a series which was the culmination of many years of travel. As Michelle was speaking about, Denyse traveled through Asia, West Africa, South America, and she collected images of structures, indigenous dwellings, bridges, wells, temples, boats, and she combined all of these visuals into her own language. And so when you see a Thomasos painting, you know right away that's her. She was interested in the structures because they really could broaden the way that she incorporates space into her work. And I think that's what she's doing here in this work. She's bringing such a wonderful complexity of space and form. And in this detail, you can see there are little staircases and architectural, almost like blueprints that are kind of hidden in the quieter moments of the work. So just to close, I wanted to show you a final painting, and it is not in the AGO's collection, but it is on view locally in Toronto. This is a painting called Babylon, and it's at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. It's one of her most important works, and I took this photo last week. I went to visit Father Daniel Donovan, who oversees the collection there. And the two of us sat with our masks on, of course, looking at the work in silence for several minutes. And it was on Wednesday, and there was that really intense midday storm, and it came through. And it was like Denyse was trying to tell me something. It was quite the moment. So the painting hangs in a room on campus that is used for events, such as music recitals. So they had the piano there, and it gives you a sense of the scale. And actually, when I walked up to the canvas, my head came to the very bottom of it. So it's hung quite high. And it is quite a powerful thing to see. I'm going to show you a detail. There you go. I apologize for my photography skills. This is just a quick snapshot of me looking up at the canvas, which is 12 by 20 feet. So it's a monumental work. And when you look at it, and I think when you look at any large Thomasos painting, you become a part of it. You are inserted into it. And this is something that Gaëtan Verna writes about really beautifully in a catalog for a show she curated at Bishop's University in 2004. The scale of a Thomasos painting produces a different sense of intimacy, one that is based on inclusion. And Verna calls this an all-encompassing elsewhere, which I thought was very spot on. So when you're looking at the work, you can see the artist's hand, her very dedicated labor, and her sheer ambition, the strength she must have had, and her choreography through space. So it really is quite a moving experience to consume all of this. And that very physical response we feel in our bodies when we see her work is a testament to her excellence as a painter. So I'm curious to hear if any of you have seen this work on campus or any of her other work, and would love to hear your responses. But yeah, I will stop there, and I think we have some questions, so maybe we will go into that. I will maneuver into my chat box here. All right, first question. Is there any significance in her choice of color palette? It is quite muted. I guess I can speak to that. She certainly was working with a palette that was muted in the earlier works, and again in some later works. And she was inspired by, again, the structures, the dwellings that she was seeing in Indigenous communities in Africa and India. So there's that brown, those earthy tones, the kind of olives that do come quite often in the work. But then later, as she's spending more and more time in New York City, the palette becomes quite a bit more vivacious and punchy. Like with the Maiden Flight, you saw the pinks and the kind of aquas and the citrons.
I read something yesterday because you and I, Renée, were talking about her palette yesterday. And it's a palette that I'm very attracted to. her pink is one of my favorite colors, but I read that in her tours of the super maximum security prisons, she was really surprised to find out that a lot of the banisters or the walls in the sort of interior stairwells were all painted in what she called primary pastels. So I imagine a primary pastel to be, you know, like a slightly heightened red. So that pink that we see so often in her work might be the same pink that covered the banisters in a prison. So it's just interesting to start thinking about what some of her motivations for color choices might be. Coming into it cold, I sort of thought those pastel colors sort of remind me so much of towns in the Caribbean. So I had wondered if it was some sort of childhood memory, but as always with Denyse, the motivations can be surprising.
Mm-hmm. I know she does return to the idea of home and her childhood home in Trinidad in works throughout her career. So it's interesting to hear you say that. And I could see that for sure being an influence. We have a second question. You quoted her writings at one point. Does she have diaries or papers that are available to scholars? From what I know, she has a few artist statements that are very, very well written. Her papers, I don't believe, are available. It is possible that there can be some work done to uncover those and make them available in future. Michelle, do you know any more about this?
I don't actually. That would be a great question to ask Olga,
Mm-hmm.
because I do think that there is so much potential for study in an academic way, not just in a curatorial way, of Denyse's work. So tracking down those resources would be really important to ensure that her voice is really present in the work going forward.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There is one of the artist statements I mentioned. It was the last one that she wrote, and it is on the McLaren Art Center's website, and it accompanied the show that she had there in 2013. She was working on it with Ben Portis, and then she passed away kind of while that was in progress, and the show opened after she had died. But the statement is it's very thorough, so I encourage you to look that up. Okay, another question. Denyse is not well known in art circles in Trinidad or the Caribbean. Are you aware of any exhibitions she might have had in the Caribbean? I am not, no. I know she showed quite a lot throughout the States and in Toronto, but I don't know, do you know, Michelle?
I don't know. I think this is sort of a way of skirting the question since I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that it was really something that Denyse had to navigate throughout her career, her sort of roving origins, being originally from the Caribbean, raised in Canada, and then having her career as an artist and teacher take place in the States. And I think one of the last conversations I had with her was about her frustration of sort of not being understood within the context of the Black arts community in New York, and sort of always feeling like the ideas that she was pursuing as an artist didn't quite weave into the ideas that curators were interested in exploring in her adopted country. So I do think that there is something so what's the word I'm looking for? So important about, I couldn't think of the word important. That's how tired I am. So important about the work coming out of this hybrid experience that didn't get the attention it deserved when she was alive.
I was thinking also about the burden of representation, and that, you know, in the 80s and 90s, especially, Black artists who are working in abstraction might have had more of a challenge getting through to mainstream venues and critics, because it was expected that their work would be figurative or representational and would literally tackle the issues of race and social justice. But because Denyse was working in abstraction and still dealing with those themes, she may have been misunderstood, or you know, it might have been more challenging for arts professionals to understand.
That's probably true, for sure. Her work, though, always I always thought. I mean, back in the day, Mark Bradford's work has changed quite a bit, but at a certain point, he was making these incredible paintings that were made out of end papers. I don't know if everybody knows what those are, but if you're a Black woman or a Black person who has their hair straightened, when you set it on rollers, you put these little papers around the ends of your hair to keep them straight. And Mark Bradford would make these paintings where he would layer, sort of burn and layer these end papers onto canvas so that it became this sort of abstracted field. And his mother was a hairdresser. And to me, that seemed like, you know, such an interesting analogy to the way Denyse was working in abstraction. So I had sort of started to piece together this little kind of connect the dot future exhibition about Black artists working in abstraction. Maybe it will come to be one day.
Yeah, keep us posted on that. That sounds amazing. Okay, we have another question. Does she have a sketch that she works from, or is it all just spontaneous and evolves as she paints? I actually was speaking to one of her former professors, John Armstrong, and he has a lot of insight into her process. And he told me that in her studio, she would use golden acrylic paints. Golden is the brand. And she would water them down in these pots, almost like yogurt containers. And she would walk around the studio, and she'd have multiple canvases on the go at once. And so she'd have her pot of paint and very carefully make marks on several canvases kind of in one round. And then she would do the same thing with another color. So there is this aspect of, you know, of spontaneity, or of not really planning, just kind of building as she goes. But that said, I do know she has quite a lot of works on paper, and the very, very, very well maybe preparatory works for the paintings. But Michelle, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. As well as having a drawing practice, though, she also, as part of her travels, would madly photograph wherever she went. So there was also an archive of photographic imagery that became source material for her images. For some reason, as you were describing her process, I was reminded of a little video that Denyse posted somewhere shortly after she adopted her little girl. And they were both in the studio, and her daughter was painting in the lower corner of one of Denyse's canvases, which leads me to think that the whole thing was quite spontaneous and you know, not that controlled. If the little girl was invited to add marks, but the other thing was just how how much facility, even as a toddler, this little girl had with the brush and putting paint on the canvas. And certainly she was learning from the best, obviously.
Absolutely. All right, we're at 5:35, so we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you so much, Michelle, for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.